people with the backwards attitude, pointing fingers, and that's a bad excuse for sitting on your ass when you complain. It's two things that you don't want to change. You ain't got no time for me, and I ain't got no sympathy for you.
Identity politics is a dangerous game to play. That doesn't stop a lot of people from casting the dice, hoping it goes their way. In this series, I'll be discussing specific issues I see negatively impacting discourse with those practicing identity politics, their specific arguments, and how many critics of these voices end up not only playing the same game they would outly decry, but also causing the same kind of anguish they claim to be actively against. In the interest of full disclosure, I'm going to say at the outset that I bear no ill will toward any individual whom I may mention, or who may identify with the points I make later on. Specifically, I dislike identity politics because it relies on hanging one's argument on one's identity. This means that any criticism of an individual's ideas is also a criticism of that individual as well. This is why Blair White's apology video to Riley Dennis was so important, even if just for her own peace of mind. And why a lot of crossing the aisle ended up taking place at VidCon this past week. Anita notwithstanding. Now, if your identity is deeply intertwined with your argument, then it's impossible to accept even reasonable objective criticism against that argument. As a result, often the lightest touch can end up being perceived as a harassment campaign. Now, that's not to say that people who engage in identity politics, such as Riley Dennis, That One Janitor, or Marina Shut Up, are thin-skinned, but instead I'd suggest that they've put themselves up as a shield for their ideas rather than the other way around. I think this is where the real crux of the problem with the optics kicks off. A lot of YouTubers who create this kind of content, engage in identity politics, end up doing this, with a few notable exceptions to that rule here and there. Blair White, Lacey Green, Zash Mardell. These are prime examples of said exception. As a result of this methodology of thought, the identity of an individual becomes inextricably linked to the ideas being discussed, whether it's a simple plea for open-mindedness or the way that questions are responded to. Now, before I delve too much further into this, I do want to say that I've never had the pleasure of speaking to any of the people who have occasionally featured in critical assessments I've watched. I'm also not a mind reader, but I do feel comfortable making the assumption that they are perfectly lovely people with a far more nuanced view on the world than what their video library or Twitter feeds put on display for the world. Now, with that in mind, my goal here is to unpack the conflict of ideas going on between the more progressive-minded creators and their critics, and why it unfortunately often devolves into complaints of harassment from one side and cries of censorship from the other. First, I want to address the critics directly. Imagine taking that aspect of yourself that you hold most dear, which informs every other aspect of yourself, and using that as the foundation for your interpretation of the world. Now imagine finding the gall to formulate ideas and arguments rooted in that same foundation, and then going on to find the bravery to put those arguments out into the world, with your face attached no less. And then having the arguments rooted in that fundamental aspect of yourself attacked by total strangers. So, I expect you'll probably say something on the order of, well, that's the nature of YouTube, and I can't disagree. Another possible response could be, that's a terrible way to ground an argument. And again, I can't disagree. Further objections might include such luminary notions that they shouldn't be on YouTube if they can't take a little criticism, but that misses the point entirely. What I'm talking about is something that I keep hearing alluded to, but not specifically mentioned, by a number of the more prominent voices amongst the landfill of id-poll critics. Empathy. The acknowledgement that the subject being criticized is also a fellow human being. Now, While I by no means have the right to tell anyone what to say or not say on their channel, I feel it would behoove many of the more vitriolic voices to exercise a moment of empathy before they sit down to write a script or record a rant. Or, if that's not quite how your creative process works, write and record to your heart's content. But take a day, step back, come back to it, whatever it is you're about to upload, and watch it with fresh eyes. Maybe even ask yourself a few questions while you watch the final cut. For example, is this a fair characterization of this person? Is this an accurate representation of their position? Am I ramping up tribalistic rhetoric? Can I change anything to make this look less like a personal attack? Would contacting the original content creator help to soften the blow at all? Now, this last one is something I rattled around in my head for a while before finally deciding to include it. How much effort is involved in simply passing the word along that I disagree with some of the points you made in your last video. I'm doing a response to it. Nothing personal, just trying to foster discussion. For fuck's sake, that's under 160 characters. You can tweet it. I already know there are a few objections to this, but hear me out, because I'm getting to those. Effectively, what we have here is a case of one group playing chess, while the other side is playing Go. Both approaches are equal in their complexity and nuance, but have starkly different strategies, goals, and methodologies. One is fairly straightforward, while the other is far more subtle. Out of deference to the subjects about whom I'm speaking, I won't qualify which side is which. Where YouTube's identity politics community is concerned, I'm not terribly well versed. Many of the behaviors that their critics point to have become a fairly common thread. Bear in mind, I'm not speaking of specific arguments here, just the interactions between the op-ed creators and their critics. The point of any opinion video, or even a commentary video, is to foster discussion. Sometimes that discussion demands disagreement. Sometimes disagreement happens due to the very nature of the subject matter being commented on. Still other times, it's the specific statement being made which casts a broad and unfavorable light over a huge segment of the population. This is not to say that every critic is worthy of being engaged in discussion. It's still the internet, after all, and attention-seeking trolls exist. But not everyone who voices dissent or disagreement is simply out to shock their audience, trigger normies, or attack you as an individual. Most are earnestly interested in the free flow of ideas. Are some of their ideas bad? Well, of course, but be honest, so are some of yours. The problem is, no one can tell one from the other until there's been an open and civil discourse on the topic. There are examples of this happening, and while not all of them result in a resolution, all of them leave those involved walking away with a better understanding of the person on the other side of that argument being refuted. Some things for the progressive wing of the YouTube community to think on. First, are you arguing in favor of practices that were abolished by the Civil Rights Act? More importantly, is accusing strangers of some form of bigotry helping to foster an open dialogue? Next, rather than carpet bombing the internet with your block button, why not respond when people simply ask questions? How would you approach someone you disagree with? Or, more appropriately, how would you like to be approached by critics of your ideas? And finally, would contacting a critic directly help you to better understand their points? Now, in the interest of fairness, the onus for reaching out can't be placed entirely on just one side of the argument. Both sides need to demonstrate a willingness to share civil discussion with the understanding that it's possible for neither to expressly agree with any of the other party's points. Avoiding this interaction doesn't validate any of your points. Instead, it paints you with an air of unearned superiority, at best. At worst, it makes you look closed-minded and haughty. In both cases, the same fundamental reality is true. You don't change minds by bashing people over the head. Trust me, it doesn't work. Instead, try changing minds by engaging those minds least resistant to new ideas. They're out there, if only you're willing to take the first step to reach out. Now, So that I don't look like a hypocrite, please feel free to comment below, look me up on Twitter, just to voice your disagreement. I promise to at least read every comment and respond to as many serious ones as possible. Thank you.